particular sideshow act was called The Hypnotist, except Quisser did admit that he was unsure why he designated this particular act as such, since there was no hypnotism involved in the performance, and of course no marquee or billboard existed either outside the tent or within it that might lead the public to expect any kind of mesmeric routine. The performer was simply clothed in a long loose overcoat and wore a plastic mask which was a plain, very pale replica of a human face, which with the exception that instead of eyes or eye holes there were two large discs with spiral designs painted upon them. This hypnotist would gesticulate chaotically in front of the audience for some moments, no doubt because his vision was obscured by the spiral patterned discs over the eyes of his mask, and then shamble off stage. There were many other sideshow acts that Quisser claimed to have seen, including the dancing puppet, the worm, the hunchback, and Dr. Fingers. With the important exception, the routine was always the same. Quisser and his parents would enter the sideshow tent and sit upon one of the rotted benches, and then some performance would begin with the performer briefly appearing on the small stage that was lit up by two ordinary floor lamps. The single exception to this routine was the attraction that Quisser called the showman. Whereas every other sideshow act began and ended after Quisser and his parents had entered the special tent and seated themselves, the one called the showman always seemed to be in progress. As soon as Quisser stepped inside the tent, invariably preceding his parents, he claimed, he saw the figure standing with his back to the audience, perfectly still upon the small stage. For whatever reason, there were never any other patrons when Quisser and his parents stopped at twilight and visited one of these gas station carnivals with their second-hand defective amusements, eventually making their way into the sideshow tent. This situation did not seem strange or troubling to the young Quisser, except on those occasions when he entered the sideshow tent and saw that it was the showman on stage. With his back to the audience, the few rows of empty benches, I should say, that looked as if they might break up altogether if anyone attempted to sit on them. Whenever faced with this scene, Quisser immediately wanted to turn around and leave the place. But then his parents would come pushing into the tent behind him, he said, and before he knew it, they would all be sitting on one of the benches in the very first row, looking at the showman. His parents never knew how terrified he was of this peculiar sideshow figure. Quisser repeated several times. Furthermore, visiting these gas station carnivals, and especially taking in the sideshows, was all done for Quisser's benefit, since his mother and father would have preferred simply filling up the family car with gasoline and then moving on toward whatever vacation spot was next on their itinerary. Quisser contended that his parents actually enjoyed watching him sit in terror before the showman until he could not stand it any longer and asked to go back to the car. At the same time, he was quite transfixed by the sight of this sideshow character, who was unlike any other kind he could remember. There he was, Quisser said, standing with his back to the audience and wearing an old top hat and a long cape which touched the ground of the small stage on which he stood. Sticking out from beneath the top hat were the coarse and dense shocks of the showman's stiff red hair, Quisser said, which looked like some kind of sickening vermin's nest. When I asked Quisser if this hair might have been a wig, I was deliberately testing his memory and imagination. He gave me a contemptuous look, as if to say that I was the one who saw the stiff red hair, not you. The only other feature that was visible to the audience, Quisser continued, were the fingers of the showman, which grasped the edges of his cape. These fingers appeared to Quisser to be somehow deformed, curling together into little claws, and were a pale greenish colour. Apparently, as Quisser viewed it, the entire stance of the figure was calculated to suggest that at any moment he might twirl about and confront the audience full face, his mouldy fingers lifting up the edges of the cape, reaching to the height of his stiff red hair. Yet the figure never budged. Sometimes it did seem to Quisser that the showman was moving his head a little to the left or a little to the right. Threatening to reveal one side of his face or the other, playing a horrible game of peek-a-boo. But ultimately, Quisser concluded that these perceived movements were illusory, and that the showman was always posed in perfect stillness, a nightmarish mannequin that invited all kinds of imaginings by its very forbearance of any gesture. It was all a nasty pretense, Quisser said to me, and then paused to finish off his glass of wine. But what if he had turned round and faced the audience? I asked. While awaiting his response, I sipped some of my mint tea, which did not seem to be doing much good for my queasy stomach, yet at the same time was causing no harm either. I lit one of the mild cigarettes that I was smoking on that occasion. "Did you hear what I said?" I said to Quisser, who had been looking towards the stage located in the opposite corner of the Crimson Cabaret. "Stage is the same," I said to Quisser quite sternly, attracting some glances from persons sitting at the other tables in the club. "Panels are the same, and the designs on them are the same." Quisser played nervously with his empty wine glass. "When I was very young," he said, "there were certain occasions on which I would see the showman, but he wasn't in his natural habitat, so to speak, of the sideshow tent." "I think I've heard enough tonight," I interjected, my hand pressing against my queasy stomach. "What are you saying?" asked Quisser. "You remember them, don't you? The gas station carnivals? Maybe just a faint memory? I was sure you would be the one to know about them." "I think I can say," I said to Quisser, "that I've heard enough about your gas station carnival story to know what it's all about." "What do you mean, what it's all about?" asked Quisser, who was still looking over at the small stage across the room. "Well, for one thing, your memories, your purported memories of that showman character. You were about to tell me that throughout your childhood you repeatedly saw this figure at various times and in various places. Perhaps you saw him in the distance of a schoolyard, standing with his back to you, or you saw him on the other side of a busy street, and yet when you crossed over to find him, he wasn't there any longer." Something like that, yeah. "And you were then going to tell me that lately you've been seeing this figure, or faint suggestions of this figure, sketchy reflections in store windows, along the sidewalk, flashing glimpses in the rear view mirror of your car. It's very much like one of your stories." "In some ways it is," I said. "In other ways it isn't. You feel that if you ever see the showman figure turn his head around to look at you, that something terrible will happen, most likely that you'll perish on the spot from some monumental shock." "Yes," agreed Quisser, "an unsustainable horror. But I haven't told you the strangest part. You're right that lately I have had glimpses of that figure. And I did see him during my childhood, outside of the sideshow tent, I mean. But the strangest part is I remember seeing him even before we went to the sideshow. This is just my point," I said. "What's that?" "Well, there never were any sideshows at the gas station carnivals." "There never were any gas station carnivals?" Nobody remembers them because they never existed. Whole idea is preposterous. But my parents were there with me. Well, yeah, sure, your dead father and your now mentally incompetent mother. Stuart, do you remember ever discussing with them these excursions, these special gas station carnivals? No, I don't. That's because you never went to any such places with them. Think about how ludicrous it sounds. That there should be filling stations out in the sticks with small carnivals attached to them to entice customers, miniature carnival rides, gas station attendants doubling up as sideshow performers. Not the showman. He was never a gas station attendant. No, of course he wasn't a gas station attendant because he was a delusion. The whole thing is an outrageous delusion. But it's also a very particular type of delusion. And what type would that be? It's not some common type of psychological delusion, if that's what you think I was going to say. I have no interest in such things at all, but I am very interested in someone suffering from a magical delusion. Even more precisely, I am interested in delusions that are the result of art magie. And do you know how long you've been under the influence of this art magie delusion? You've lost me. It's simple, I said. How long have you imagined all this nonsense about the gas station carnivals and specifically about this character that you've called the showman? I guess it would be more or less absurd at this point to insist that I've remembered this for my whole life, even if that's exactly how it seems and that's exactly how it was. Of course it would be absurd because you're definitely delusional. So, I'm delusional about the showman, but you're not delusional about, what do you call it? Art magie. For as long as you've been a victim of this particular art magie, this is how long you've been delusional about the gas station, carnivals, and all related phenomena. And how long is that? Asked Chrissa. Since you humiliated the Crimson Woman by calling her a deluded no talent. I told you, she's got connections that you know nothing about. I'm talking about something from my childhood. You're talking about last week. That's because last week is exactly how long you've been suffering from this delusion. Don't you see that through her art magie, she has caused you to suffer from the worst kind of delusion, what I would call a retroactive delusion. And it's not only you who's been affected in the past days and weeks and even months. Everyone around here has sensed the threat of this art magic. For some time now, I'm beginning to think that I found out about it too late myself. Much too late. You know what it is to suffer from a delusion of the retroactive kind, but do you know what it's like to suffer from a stomach disorder? I've been sitting here in the Crimson Woman's Club, drinking mint tea served by a waitress who is the Crimson Woman's friend, thinking that mint tea is just the thing for my ailing stomach, when it may very well be aggravating my condition, or even causing it to transform in accordance with the principles of art magie into something more serious, more strange. But the Crimson Woman is not the only one practicing this art magie. It's happening everywhere around here. It has drifted in like a fog at sea, and now we are lost in it. Look at the faces in this room, and then tell me that you alone are the victim of a horrible art magie. The Crimson Woman has quite a few adversaries, just as she is connected with powerful allies. How can I say exactly who they are? Some group specializing in art magie, no doubt. But I can't just say with a fatuous certainty, yes, it must be some gang of Illuminati or esoteric scientists, as so many have begun styling themselves these days. But it all sounds like one of your stories. Of course it does. Don't you think she knows that? But I'm not the one with this grotesque yarn about the gas station carnival and the sideshow tent with a small stage, not unlike the stage on the opposite side of this room. You can't keep your eyes off it, I can see that, and so can the other people in the club. And I know what you think you are seeing over there. Assuming you know what you're talking about, said Quissa, who was now forcing himself to look away from the stage area of the club. What am I supposed to do about it? You can start by keeping your eyes off that stage across the room. There's nothing you can see over there except an art magie delusion. There's nothing necessarily fatal or permanent about the affliction, but you must believe that you will recover, just as you would if you were suffering from some non-fatal physical disease. Otherwise, these delusions may turn into something far more deadly on either a psychic or physical level, or both. Take my advice as someone who dabbles in tales of extraordinary doom and walk away from this madness. There are enough fatalities of a mundane sort. Find a quiet place and wait for one of them to carry you off. I could now see that the intense conviction of my words had finally had its effect on Quissa.